What if the Spanish Armada won? Picture it. Black-sailed giants rolling through a churning English channel, lanterns swinging over wet decks, the smell of salt and gunpowder hanging in cold air. London's bells toll in the distance, and on the wind, a rumor: the Spanish are coming ashore. The Queen's banners flutter, not with pride, but with dread. If those sails had cut through fire and storm, England wouldn't just lose a battle, the world would change. To understand the shockwave, let's ground ourselves in what really happened. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain launched the Armada, a massive fleet built to smash English resistance, end Protestant support for the Dutch rebels, and topple the troublemaker Queen Elizabeth I. The plan was bold and complicated. Spain's Admiral Medina Sidonia would shepherd the Armada up the Channel, link with the Duke of Parma's veterans in the Spanish Netherlands, cross to England, land that army, and march on London. The English, led by Drake and Howard, struck first with fast maneuverable ships, cutting at the edges like wolves around a bull. Then came the fire. Literally, English fire ships broke Spanish formation off Calais. The Armada scattered. The Channel narrowed into chaos. And the weather, that infamous Protestant wind, drove hulking galleons onto rocks and out into the North Sea. The invasion never happened. England survived. The Dutch revolt hung on, and the stage was set for a century where English sea power, later British, started to bloom. But it was close. Change a few hours of wind. Let Parma's barges slip cleanly into formation. Imagine the English fire ships lighting up the night, but the Spanish captains holding their nerve. Sails trimmed perfectly, cannon loaded cold and steady. The line doesn't break. The Channel, for one critical week, becomes a Spanish road. So let's turn the map. In our timeline, the meeting happens. Parma's Army of Flanders, brutal, disciplined, battle-hardened from years in the Low Countries, links with the Armada under a protective canopy of Spanish guns. They cross under gray skies, oars dipping in grim rhythm. The English fleet, harried and low on powder, can't close the distance. On the Kentish coast, foreign banners bloom like blood-red flowers on pebbled beaches. Drums beat. The Spanish tercios form in their famous squares. Parma's standard rises. London doesn't fall in a single day, but it feels like it. Panic eats through the city faster than any fire. Elizabeth rides out in armor at Tilbury, that iconic image of defiance. But this time, the road to London is choked with refugees. The court wavers. Some nobles hedge their bets, whispering safety in surrender. The tower's gates slam shut, then open again. Within weeks, the Spanish-backed Regency proclaims order. Heresy ended, piracy ended, and peace restored, under Catholic terms. The Queen is forced into exile or held as a carefully guarded guest, a diplomatic hostage, depending on how bloody you want this story to be. England is not annexed like a province, but harnessed as a client kingdom. A restored Catholic council rules in the name of legitimacy, maybe under a Spanish-friendly noble, maybe even a Habsburg relative like Isabella Clara Eugenia as a figure of sacred stability. The immediate consequences are brutal and clean. English support for the Dutch rebels evaporates overnight. English ports that once welcomed Dutch ships now turn them away at the sight of Orange. Privateers who hunted Spanish treasure vanish into the fog or are hanged at dockside. The Dutch Republic, isolated, faces Parma without English muskets and money. That famous stubborn independence becomes a bleeding siege. Amsterdam, instead of rising as the financial heart of Europe, watches as its lifeline is cut artery by artery. Antwerp, under Spanish control, is groomed back toward primacy as a carefully taxed, tightly watched hub. In Ireland, the world flips. The 9 Years' War hasn't yet begun, but the powder is already piled. With a Catholic England under Spanish influence, Irish chieftains no longer fight on the margins. They align with power. Spanish garrisons in the southern ports. Spanish gold in Gaelic hands. Ulster becomes less a wild frontier and more a chessboard. Plantation schemes that would later remake the island stall or reverse. Across the Irish Sea, Scotland senses an opportunity and a threat. James VI, who in our timeline inherits the English crown in 1603, finds the door to London locked. A Catholic client monarchy in England denies the Stuart Union. The island's center of gravity shifts south toward Madrid's shadow, not north toward Edinburgh's crown. Quick pause. What's your call? Would a Spanish-backed England crush the Dutch or ignite Europe faster? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this alternate voyage pulls you in, tap like and subscribe so you never miss the next turning of history's wheel. Back on the continent, the calendar ticks toward 1618 and the powder barrel called the 30 Years' War. In our history, that war becomes a sprawling, catastrophic struggle where politics and faith knot around each other until Europe staggers out, half ruined, with a new order called Westphalia. But with England under Catholic control and the Dutch rebellion strangled early, the Protestant alliance is weaker. Sweden still rises under Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, but his supply lines grow longer and lonelier. The war that once balanced into a pan-European deadlock now tilts. The Habsburgs, wearing two crowns, Spanish and Imperial, press hard. And yet there's a twist. France, Catholic but allergic to Habsburg encirclement, remains what it always is under Cardinal Richelieu, a disruptor. Paris feeds fires with money and spies, but without a free Dutch market and without English ports, France fights uphill against a Habsburg Channel and a Habsburg Rhine. The result? The 30 Years' War ends sooner, harsher. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, hardens like winter ice across more of the map. But the latitude for Protestant survival shrinks. Central Europe tilts Catholic. The borderlands of faith move east and north. And where there's faith, there's printing. No King James Bible in 1611. No authorized English text echoing through parish and colony, stitching together a language and a people. The English Bible that becomes a cultural spine in our world never exists. Instead, English presses operate under Spanish eyes, licensing sermons, trimming plays, and measuring every page against orthodoxy. Shakespeare still writes, he's already writing, but the dangerous edges dull. The unruly energy that later explodes in pamphlets, in Civil War debate, in radical tracts about liberty and conscience, that energy bleeds out into exile or goes quiet under watchful eyes. Now stretch the lens across oceans. Roanoke is a ghost and remains one. Jamestown never sails. Plymouth never leaves. The English Atlantic, that string of risky wooden experiments that become 13 bristling colonies, is cut before the first real tree falls. Spain holds Florida, the Caribbean, and reaches north up the coast, planting missions and presidios in Chesapeake bays that, in our world, will one day fly a star-spangled flag. France, pushing down from the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, finds fewer enemies and more open water. New France swells in the interior, trading furs along rivers that carry names in French and Algonquin, not English. The map reads Spanish on the coasts, French in the forests, and a quiet, tightened England watching from a colder shore. Without a Dutch Republic and an English mercantile revolution, the global trading system consolidates under Iberian frameworks. The Portuguese, already unioned with Spain in 1580, see their network protected rather than preyed upon. Fewer Dutch and English privateers ripping at the seams means more silver safely arrives in Seville. More spices remain under monopoly. More sugar flows in regulators' hands. The cost? Less creative destruction. The freewheeling joint stock innovation that births the Dutch VOC and the English East India Company either never materializes, or it emerges smaller under French sponsorship. Asia's coasts feel a different pressure. Instead of an English Bengal rising into a British Raj, you get French comptoirs expanding, Portuguese forts reinforced, and a slower, more bureaucratic grip on India. Tipu Sultan, the Marathas, the Mughals, they meet a Latin, not an English tide. Follow the money home. Amsterdam doesn't become the clearinghouse of Europe. London never births a Bank of England in 1694 to fund a modern navy and a modern state. Without those two financial engines, insurance markets shrink, government bonds remain feudal and fiddly, and the state's ability to project force across seas lags. The Industrial Revolution, a machine born from coal, capital, and tinkering, still sparks because human ingenuity is stubborn. But where? The Midlands workshops that, in our world, turn into iron lungs of industry rely on a messy open culture that tolerates dissenters, inventors, and risk-takers. Our alternate England is less hospitable to that chaos. The baton passes. France, with its larger population and state-backed academies, edges into steam earlier. Or the Rhineland, rich with coal, crossed by rivers, and crowded with small states hungry for advantage, becomes the furnace. By 1800, the first rail hiss might snake from Paris to Rouen or from Cologne to the Ruhr, not from Stockton to Darlington. Roll into the age of revolution. No 13 colonies means no American Revolution as we know it. No declaration ringing out in English about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But pressure always finds a crack. The Caribbean's plantations remain crown jewels, and the human costs stand. Slavery does not soften because English ships are absent. If anything, a Spanish-French duopoly entrenches it longer in some zones. The first successful slave revolution Haiti still ignites, perhaps even sooner, shockwaving imperial capitals. Across mainland North America, a Spanish viceroyalty of the North might one day face Creole elites who dream in Spanish of autonomy, not in English of independence. The United States never appears. Instead, you get a quilt of Iberian-born republics along the Atlantic coast, drifting into the orbit of Paris or Madrid, depending on who holds more gold that decade. And Napoleon? Without Britain, the chessboard flips. The Royal Navy, the perennial spoiler of imperial dreams, doesn't exist in its world historic form. Trafalgar never happens because the fleets and rivals that produce it never align. Napoleon, rising out of revolution into empire, faces a different coalition. Habsburg south, Prussian east, Russian vastness, and a Spain whose arteries are still fat with silver. But without a British blockade and British gold, his continental system doesn't slam into the same wall. He could sweep the map even harder, unless he collides head-on with a Habsburg-led Catholic bloc that is heavier than in our world. Europe becomes a duel of giants. Bourbon France and Habsburg Iberia Germany slugging for control of the Rhine and Italy, while Russia watches like a bear at the tree line. There's no single master of the seas. There's a crowded Atlantic with Spanish and French flags patrolling and daring each other, and no island fortress pumping money into every anti-French cause. The soft power you live with today feels different. No global English. Shakespeare is revered at home, but the stage of world literature speaks Spanish in plazas and French in salons. The lingua franca of science, likely French, then German. Newton, if he exists, grows in the long shadow of censorship or slips into obscurity, a genius without a platform. Instead, Descartes, Pascal, Huygens, Leibniz, and Lavoisier fill schools and journals that knit Paris to Mainz to Milan. The Royal Society never convenes as a lighthouse of open inquiry. The Academy of Sciences and German universities become the archipelago of innovation. Steam engines and spinning frames spread, but their manuals read in dialects of Paris and the Rhineland, not Birmingham and Manchester. Religion, too, redraws its frontier. Without a hardy Anglican middle path, Protestantism becomes more polarized. Calvinist hard edges in Scotland and parts of the Empire, Lutheran heartlands in the north, but fewer safe harbors in the Atlantic world. Puritans who might have sailed to New England cannot. Some vanish into Scottish kirks. Others thread themselves into clandestine meetings and secret presses, whispering psalms under the watch of informers. The wars of the Three Kingdoms, our English Civil War, never break in the same way. No Cromwell smashing kings and then ruling a tired commonwealth. Instead, England's descent simmers low for generations, rising in small revolts, then fading, contained by a Catholic establishment that mixes carrot, stick, and Spanish regiments on standby in Portsmouth. Fast forward into the 19th century. Who polices the world's trade routes? Not a single Pax Britannica, but competing patrols, treaties, and ambushes. The fight against piracy is slower. The campaign against the slave trade? Without British abolitionists pushing a global navy to hunt slavers, abolition comes patchwork, pulled forward by moral thunder in Paris and revolution in colonies, then tugged backward by sugar interests and royal treasuries. Telegraph cables knit continents later. Global finance fuses in Paris and Vienna, not London. The city never earns its capital C. By the 20th century, the ripple becomes a wave that never breaks into the shores you know. Without a dominant English-speaking superpower, the cultural century belongs to others. Hollywood? Maybe it starts in New Orleans under a Spanish-speaking republic, or in Montreal under a French-American federation. The world wars would be wars of Europe's old families and their industrial empires, still catastrophic, still mechanized. But the coalitions are unfamiliar. The United States, as an idea and a engine, is replaced by a looser constellation of Atlantic republics. Power tilts among Madrid, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, not across the Atlantic to Washington and New York. Does this all hinge on a few sails catching a different gust? It does, and it doesn't. The Armada's victory would not make the world Spanish overnight, nor could it erase England's island stubbornness. Resistance would grow, kings fall, empires crack. But a Spanish-backed England in 1588 breaks a chain reaction we often take for granted. The Dutch rising, the English commercial surge, the colonization of a coast that becomes a country, the language that becomes a global default. Change that chain, and the 21st century speaks with a different accent. So, what if the Spanish Armada won? You'd wake up in a world where the channel looks south, not outwards, where the map writes more words in Spanish and French, where liberty and science still fight their way forward, but through other mouths, other markets, other wars. One stormy week in 1588 didn't just defend an island. It opened a path to the world you know. Tip the wind, and the path runs somewhere else entirely.